They shot the human general, and a 500-year peace treaty ended in an instant. The general was already walking to the podium when I noticed the Varek delegation had moved. Not their seats. Their angle. I had the seating chart in my hand. I had been carrying it for 3 days, ever since General Daniil Okafor asked me to pull the security logs, and I found nothing wrong in them, nothing at all, which was the worst possible thing to find. Clean records, in my experience, are records that have been cleaned. The Varek primary seats were supposed to be at ground level. Summit rotation protocol placed them there. 500 years of rotation protocol placed them there. They were in the elevated tier. I turned to say something to Colonel Owen Hart, who was standing 2 meters to my left. I opened my mouth. The sound reached me after. That is the thing about the worst moments. The thing nobody tells you. The sound comes late, like your brain is trying to give you 1 extra second in a world where it has not happened yet. General Daniil Okafor had been walking to the podium for the renewal address. He had done this walk 41 times. I had watched him do it 6 times in the 6 years I had served as his adjutant. He walked the same way every time, steady and unhurried, the walk of a man who knew exactly where he was going and was in no rush because the podium was not going anywhere. He was 3 steps from it when he fell. I was already moving before I understood why. 6 years under that man trains you like that. You move and you think later. The hall was chaos. The specific kind that happens when several hundred beings from 5 different species all process the same event at different speeds. The Veth delegates near the south wall made their distress sound, a low resonant hum that cut through everything. Human diplomatic staff were pulling back behind chairs. Varek choir speakers in the elevated tier were perfectly, absolutely still. That stillness. I remember that. I reached the general. I knew immediately. I had seen enough in my career to know. But I knelt anyway, because what else do you do? And his eyes were still open and still sharp, the way they always were, and he looked at me with the expression of a man who had seen this coming and had chosen to walk toward it regardless. His summit identification badge had come free. It was on the floor near my knee. I picked it up. I do not know why. I was not thinking. My hands were doing one thing while my mind was doing 6 other things at once. The badge was there and I picked it up and I closed my fingers around it and I did not let go for a very long time after that. The hall was still loud around me when the Varek choir speaker rose in the elevated tier. His name was Vel Sora. He was approximately 900 years old by human reckoning. He had the harmonic voice of his kind, layered and resonant, the sound of more than one mind speaking through one throat. When Varek choir speakers address a gathering, they do not raise their voice. They simply make the air in the room agree with them. He began to speak. I want to tell you that I did not understand what he was saying at first. That the shock had slowed my processing. That I needed time. That would be a lie. I understood every word. He said the Varek choir had taken this action in the interest of Concord stability. He said General Okafor had been, for decades, the primary obstacle to the restructuring of humanity's position within the Concord framework. He said that with this obstacle removed, the path was now clear for humanity to comply with the revised Solon Accords, which the Varek were invoking immediately. He said humanity had 72 hours to stand down its military apparatus and submit to full Concord oversight. He said the choir was offering this as a mercy. He said they were offering humanity the chance to choose what the expansion wars had settled by force 500 years ago. He said all of this with the calm certainty of a being who had watched 4 civilizations rise and fall and believed, from the bottom of 9 centuries of observation, that he already knew how this ended. I was still kneeling on the floor. Owen Hart had moved to stand above me. I could feel other human staff repositioning nearby, not panicking, not running. Positioning. The way you position when something has started. I looked at the treaty text on the eastern wall of the hall. It had been there since Solon Station was built. My mother knew those words. Her mother had read them aloud at her citizenship ceremony. Hundreds of millions of humans had grown up with those words the way you grow up with the walls of your own home. In the interest of lasting coexistence, the signatories commit to mutual restraint and the subordination of historical grievance to shared future. It was a very good sentence. I read it one last time. Then I stood up. Owen was watching me. He had the look on his face that I would see on every human face in that hall in the next 3 minutes. A look I recognized because I had worn it before. Not grief. Not yet. Grief arrives after. What comes first is something older, something that lives below grief the way stone lives below soil. I put the badge in my left breast pocket. I said to Owen, "Get everyone to the West Communications Bay. Now." Not in a moment. Now. He moved. I walked to the nearest communications terminal in the gallery and I opened 14 priority channels simultaneously and I composed the shortest message I had ever written in my military career. 4 words. I looked at them on the screen for exactly 2 seconds. Then I sent them to every human military installation in the 14 systems. The Varek choir speaker was still talking in the hall behind me. He had moved on to the procedural elements of the revised accords. He had the serene confidence of a being who believed the hard part was already done. I thought about General Okafor eating toast that morning. Asking me about the seating chart. Telling me to move the human delegation to the West Gallery. Not explaining why. He had known. He had walked to that podium knowing. I have spent a great deal of time since then thinking about whether he moved me to the West Gallery to protect me, or to leave a witness. Both, probably. He was efficient like that. The 72-hour clock had started. I put my hand on the pocket where the badge was and I went back to work. The next 48 hours moved in a way I can only describe as 2 things happening at the same speed in 2 different directions. The first thing was the Concorde fracturing. The second thing was something else entirely. The emergency session convened 6 hours after the hall. 3 species voted to formally censure the Varek action, the Veth, the Surai, and the Marin Collective. 2 abstained. The Varek choir sat in the chamber with the immovable patience of a species that had attended 4 civilizational endings and was already composing its remarks for a 5th. Censure is noise. They knew that. The votes were noted. The record was updated. The Varek delegation thanked the chamber for its input and requested the session move to procedural items related to human compliance with the revised accords. I was not in the chamber. I was in the communications bay, running on 2 hours of sleep and something from a ration pack that was technically food. Colonel Owen Hart had taken over physical security on Solon Station. Captain Nina Cole had assumed management of the human diplomatic staff. I was handling everything else, which was a larger category than it had been 24 hours ago. The responses to my forward message had been coming in for 12 hours. Not confirmations. Not received and understood. The responses were different. The first came from the new Ankara orbital shipyards, from a civilian logistics director named Petra Doyle. She sent 2 sentences. Standing Orders File, Contingency Package 7. Confirm Activate. Contingency Package 7. General Okafor had drafted that document 22 years ago. It sat in every human military installation's secured archive. It had never been opened outside of a drill. I understood what it contained in general terms, the way you know the contents of a fire suppression system. You understand what it does without spending much time thinking about when you would actually need it. I confirmed activation. Petra Doyle sent back, understood, yards going to full schedule. That was it. No ceremony. No speeches. She was already at work. Within 6 hours I had similar confirmations from 43 installations. By hour 12 it was over 200. They were not waiting for a command structure to reassemble. They were not waiting for the diplomats to finish arguing in the chamber. They were reading 4 words and a standing order and making decisions. This is the thing about the way General Okafor had built things. He had not built a military that needed him. He had built a military that understood what he had been trying to do, deeply enough that they could keep doing it without him. You cannot stop that with one shot. You cannot end an idea by removing the person who had it, because the idea already lives in several billion other minds. The Varek choir did not understand this. I am certain of it. They had studied human command structure. They knew the names, ranks, and decision-making hierarchies. What they had never modeled was what happens when none of that matters, because everyone below the hierarchy has already decided. I know the exact moment I understood how badly they had miscalculated. It was hour 31. I was reviewing incoming reports when I received a message from a garrison commander named Colin Marsh, stationed at a small relay point in the outer system, a place that did not appear on most Concord maps and had, by any military calculation, negligible strategic value. His message said, "I have 60 people and 1 operational cruiser. I have been running the contingency package numbers. I want you to know that we are ready. All 60. We took a vote. They took a vote. 60 people at a relay point that nobody had heard of, and they took a vote, and all 60 voted the same way." I held that message in my mind for a long time. I thought about the 6 names I recite every morning. My crew from the Yavu station incident, the people I had lost before I understood how to protect them. I had recited those names every single morning for years. Not as grief, exactly. Not anymore. More as a kind of accounting. A running total of what I owed. I added a name. Then I went back to the reports. The Concord chamber reconvened at hour 36. The Varek choir had expected the session to address human compliance. Instead, the VETH lead delegate, Ambassador Hara, presented an emergency motion challenging the legal validity of the revised Solon Accords, arguing the Varek had no authority to invoke them unilaterally. The choir responded with patience. Legal challenges could be heard. Timelines, however, were not subject to legal review. The 72-hour window remained. 36 hours left. Owen came to find me at hour 38. He looked the way all of us looked by that point, functional but worn down, the face of someone running on the knowledge that stopping was not an option yet. He said, "The choir sent another message. They want a formal response to their terms." I said, "I know." He said, "Nina thinks we should at least acknowledge the window. Buy time." I looked at him. Owen Hart is a careful man. A measured officer who thinks 3 moves ahead and does not like unnecessary confrontation. I respect that about him enormously. I also knew that he was wrong. Buying time for what? I said. Everything that needs to happen is already happening. Colin Marsh and 60 people at a relay station are already happening. Petra Doyle and the new Ankara yards are already happening. 247 installations are already happening. Owen was quiet. "We do not need more time," I said. "They do." He thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded once and went back to his post. I drafted the formal response to the Varek choir's terms. It was 3 sentences long. I read it twice, changed 1 word, and sent it. It said, "Humanity acknowledged receipt of the revised Solon Accords. Humanity found the terms outside the scope of what the Solon Treaty authorized. Humanity would communicate further terms at such time as the present situation was resolved." Not a refusal. Not a declaration. Just a door closing, quietly and firmly, in the language the Varek choir had themselves invented. The response from the choir came 40 minutes later. It noted humanity's position. It noted that the 72-hour window remained open. It expressed confidence that further reflection would lead to productive reconsideration. They still thought this was a negotiation. At hour 47, 15 hours before their window closed, I stood at the large viewport in the communications bay and watched the station's external monitoring feeds. In the distance, 2 human cruisers had arrived in the Solon system. Not aggressively positioned. Not broadcasting anything. Just there. They had not been there 6 hours ago. I put my hand in my pocket. The badge was there. I thought, he would have had something to say about this. Something dry and probably difficult and completely accurate. He had a way of naming things that made them easier to carry. I did not have his gift for that. What I had was his standing orders, a commission, and 60 people at a relay station who had taken a vote. The window closed at hour 72. Nobody on our side was watching it. We were already past it. 3 species. That is how many came to us in the first week. Not the full Concord. Not yet. But the Veth, the Surai, and the Marin Collective each sent quiet messages through back channels, each carefully worded to avoid the appearance of a formal position, each saying, in the specific diplomatic language that means one thing while saying another, that they were watching, and that they found the current trajectory concerning, and that they wished to remain informed. That is diplomacy 4, we are not going to stop you. I passed each message to Nina Cole, who was now functioning as our acting ambassador, a title she had accepted with the expression of someone handed a live animal they had not asked for. Nina was a career diplomat's aide who had been 3 levels below the actual ambassador when the ambassador left the hall in a medical evacuation. She was sharp, prepared, and deeply unhappy about her current situation. I told her she was doing fine. She told me to mind my own business. I respected that. On the 4th day, the Varek choir requested a formal session of the full Concord. Their stated purpose was to present evidence that humanity was in violation of the revised accords and to request the Concord authorize enforcement measures. 3 species declined to attend. The session proceeded anyway, with 2 species present. The record noted the absences without comment. The choir presented its case to an audience that already agreed with it. Meanwhile, at the new Ankara yards, they had moved to 3-shift operation. I know this not because I received a military report but because Petra Doyle sent me a personal message that said, 3 shifts. My people asked for it. I did not order it. Thought you should know. I thought about that message for a long time. This is the thing I have tried to explain to people since then, the thing that is hardest to put into words without it sounding like something it is not. It was not anger driving all of this. Not exactly. Anger is loud and hot and burns through its fuel fast. What was driving this was quieter and more durable. It was the specific determination of people who had done the math on what was taken and had decided, each one privately and then collectively, that the accounting was not finished. Humans are, as a species, very good at math. On the 6th day, Commander Seth Price arrived at Solon Station on the light cruiser Verona, carrying formal orders from what remained of the human military command structure in the outer systems. The orders confirmed my temporary authority as senior military officer present. They also confirmed 3 things I had already implemented on my own authority. Seth was the kind of officer who can deliver complicated news with a completely level face. He handed me the orders, waited while I read them, and then said, "The outer system installations have finished their initial deployment positioning. Admiral K. Doyle sends her regards." Admiral K. Doyle. I had met her twice. She was 70 years old, had been in service for 48 of those years, and was reported to have the temperament of a person who had run out of patience approximately 2 decades ago and had been operating without it ever since. She had served under General Okafor early in her career. I said, "Tell the Admiral her regards are received." Seth nodded and went to find somewhere to sleep. The Concord issued a formal statement on day 7. It noted the ongoing dispute between the Varek choir and the human contingent. It called for restraint. It used the word restraint 4 times in 6 paragraphs, which told me everything about what the Concord was actually prepared to do. I read the statement. I read the treaty text on the wall behind me. I thought, 500 years ago we signed that document because we had no choice. We were new to this. Outnumbered, outpowered, and the expansion wars had cost us more than we could publicly calculate. We signed because General Okafor's predecessor, General Lina Howe, looked at the terms and looked at what refusing them would cost and made the hard decision that keeping humanity alive mattered more than any particular version of dignity. We kept that treaty for 500 years. Every clause. Every provision. Every limitation on military deployment and territorial expansion and independent diplomatic contact. We kept it when it was inconvenient. We kept it when other Concord members stretched it to their advantage. We kept it when 3 different Varek delegations in 3 different centuries tried to quietly revise our membership terms through procedural footnotes. We kept it because Okafor told us to. Because he was holding the line with his reputation, his relationships, and 40 years of careful and relentless diplomatic work. They did not shoot a symbol. They shot a wall. And a wall, once taken down, does not go back up. It becomes material for something else. On day 9, the Varek choir sent its first communication directly to me rather than to the formal human diplomatic office. It came through a back channel, which meant it was an unofficial message, which meant they did not want it on the record, which meant they were beginning to understand that the record was not developing the way they had expected. The message was from Vel Sora himself. He wrote that he wished to open a private dialogue. He wrote that the current trajectory was not in the interest of Concord stability. He wrote that the Varek choir had anticipated a period of human reaction and had factored this into their projections, but that certain elements of the current situation had moved beyond their projected parameters. That last sentence. I read it 3 times. Certain elements had moved beyond their projected parameters. I thought about Colin Marsh at his relay station. I thought about 60 people taking a vote. I thought about Petra Doyle's 3 shift yards, and Admiral Doyle's deployment positions, and Seth Price arriving with orders that confirmed decisions I had already made. I thought about the 3 species that had declined to attend the Concord session. I thought, you built a model. The model was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not adjusted for margin of error wrong. Structurally wrong, fundamentally wrong, because the model assumed humans organize from the top down, and that removing the top produces paralysis. But we are not built that way. We never were. I did not respond to Vel Sora's message that day. I let it sit. On day 11 I called a meeting with Owen, Nina, Seth, and Captain Leo Webb, who had arrived the previous day from the mid-system fleet. We sat around a table in the communications bay and I laid out the current situation in the flattest possible terms. The Varek choir had taken an action. The action had been based on a calculation. The calculation was wrong. They now knew the calculation was wrong. They were beginning to look for a way to communicate about this without admitting the calculation was wrong. Leo Webb said, so they want to negotiate. They want to talk, I said. Whether that becomes negotiation depends on what we say. Nina asked, what are we going to say? I picked up the badge. I looked at it for a moment in the way that had become automatic by that point, a check, a steadying reference. I said, we are going to let them ask the question first. The Varek choir asked the question on day 14. They asked it through Vel Sora's back channel, still unofficially, still careful to leave nothing on the formal record. The question was framed the way old civilizations frame questions they are not comfortable asking directly, wrapped in 3 layers of procedural language and subordinate clauses until the actual question, sitting in the center of it all, was almost invisible. The actual question was, what would it take to stop this? I read it once. I gave it to Nina to read. I gave it to Owen to read. Seth read it over Owen's shoulder. Leo Webb read it last and put it down on the table and said, with the tone of a man confirming a long-held suspicion, they are scared. Not of us. Not exactly. Of what they had set in motion. Of the variable their model had failed to account for. 900 years of watching civilizations rise and fall and they had still somehow missed the most important thing. We did not answer the question immediately. We let 14 more days pass. I want to explain what those 14 days looked like, because the telling matters. The Varek choir and their allies expected those days to be days of pure military buildup, ships and weapons and positioning. Those things were happening, yes. Admiral Doyle's fleet was moving. The new Ankara yards were at full capacity. Installations across the 14 systems were completing their contingency protocols. But that was not all that was happening. What was also happening was this: on a station in the Marin Collective's territory, a human engineer named Gwen Adler, who had been working on a propulsion problem for 11 years, solved it. She had been working on it since before any of this started. She solved it on day 16 because she was at the station anyway and the work was in front of her and she was the kind of person who solves problems when they are in front of her. The solution would reduce transit time between the mid and outer systems by 31%. She filed it with the technical registry, sent a copy to the military logistics division, and went to sleep. On day 19, a team of 64 civilians at the Dorian Research Post completed an environmental modeling study they had been running for 8 years. The study identified 3 currently uninhabited systems with high terraforming potential. It had nothing to do with the ongoing conflict. It was simply science that had been in progress and was now finished. They published it. On day 20, a 14-year-old girl on New Ankara wrote a poem about General Okafor that spread across the human communications network within 48 hours and was eventually read by more people than I could calculate. I read it twice. It was not a sad poem. It was not an angry poem. It was a poem about a man who had spent his life building something, written by a child who understood, with perfect clarity, what had been taken and what had not. I did not send it to the Varek choir. I did not need to. On day 23, Vel Sora sent another message. He noted that his earlier question had not received a response. He expressed continued willingness to discuss a resolution. His harmonics, translated into text, had a quality I had not seen in his earlier communications. He was no longer certain. I had seen General Okafor do this once, in a negotiation I observed early in my service as his adjutant: let the other side's confidence erode under its own weight, not through pressure but through time and visibility. Let them watch what they had set in motion. Let them add it up themselves. The math was not going their way. I responded to Vel Sora on day 24. My response was short. I said that humanity was willing to discuss a framework for formal talks. I said the framework would need to be established on terms that acknowledged the action taken against General Okafor and its consequences. I said I was available at a time of his choosing. His response came within the hour. He proposed Solon Station. The same hall. He said the choice was symbolic and he believed both parties would find the symbolism appropriate. I thought about what appropriate meant to a 900-year-old being. I wrote back, agreed. What followed was 6 weeks of preliminary negotiations before the formal talks began. 6 weeks of the exact kind of work that General Okafor had spent 40 years doing, the careful, grinding, detail-level work of building a framework that both sides could walk into without losing something they could not afford to lose. I am not naturally gifted at this work. I am a soldier and an adjutant. My skills are in execution, not architecture. But I had 6 years of watching the best do it. And I had his standing orders, which were thorough enough to serve as a manual. Nina Cole turned out to be extraordinary at this work. I want to say that directly and without qualification because she has not, in my view, received appropriate acknowledgement for what she did in those 6 weeks. She had been handed a title she did not ask for in a situation nobody had prepared her for, and she was better at it than anyone had a right to expect. She and I argued continuously and productively. She was right approximately 60% of the time. I told her so. She said 60% was not good enough and went back to work. Owen Hart managed security, logistics, and a dozen other categories of problem with the quiet competence that I have come to understand is its own kind of excellence. He is not a dramatic man. He does not seek recognition. He solves the problem in front of him and then looks for the next one. In a crisis, that quality is worth more than almost anything else. Seth Price managed communications with Admiral Doyle's fleet, which required a specific combination of precision and patience because Admiral Doyle had very strong opinions about how things should be proceeding and was not shy about sharing them at length. Seth managed this with a level expression every single day and I remain impressed. Leo Webb coordinated with the 3 species that had declined the Concord session. They were not formal allies, not yet, but they were not obstacles either, which was, given everything, better than we had any right to expect. During those 6 weeks I did 2 things each morning without variation. I recited 6 names. And I read the 4 words I had sent on the first day, still saved in my outbox. Not as reminder. Not as motivation. As calibration. A way of staying oriented to where this had started and why. On the last night before the formal talks began, Owen found me in the communications bay, which is where he always found me. He sat down across from me and said nothing for a while, which is his method of checking on someone. I said, I keep thinking about what he would say about all of this. Owen said, I think he would say you are doing fine. I said, he would not say that. He would find 3 specific things I had done wrong and suggest improvements. Owen almost smiled. Yes. And then he would say you were doing fine. I took out the badge and put it on the table between us. Owen looked at it. He had never asked about it once in 6 weeks. I said, I do not know why I picked this up. I just did. Owen said, I know why. I looked at him. He said, because someone had to. I put the badge back in my pocket. I went to sleep for 4 hours, which was the most consecutive rest I had managed since this had started. In the morning I put on the dress uniform I had brought to Solon Station for the original summit and I went to the hall. The treaty text was still on the wall. I had given specific instructions that it not be removed or covered. I wanted it there. I wanted everyone in that room to be able to read it. Both sides. The Varek delegation arrived first. They always did. Vel Sora was at the head of the delegation. He was dressed in the formal choir speaker's garments, deep teal and silver, the colors of the primary choir caste. He was flanked by 2 secondary speakers and 6 diplomatic aides. Behind them, seated separately and specifically, was the member of the delegation I had insisted on. He had no formal role. No title on the proceedings document. He was listed only as an observer. His name was Choir Speaker Ran Voss. He was the one who had risen in the elevated tier and made the announcement on the day of the general's death. He was the one who had told the gathered Concord that humanity had 72 hours to comply. His presence in this room had been non-negotiable. I had been explicit about that in the preliminary weeks. When the Varek delegation initially objected, I removed my response from the preliminary framework and waited. They returned to the question 4 days later and agreed. He sat in a chair against the far wall. He was 900 years old and he had the absolute stillness of his kind, the stillness that other species sometimes mistake for peace. It was not peace. I knew that, and he knew that I knew it, and we had never spoken a word directly and would not today, and that arrangement was also something I had designed deliberately. The human delegation entered after the Varek. Nina Cole walked at the front. She had insisted on that and she was right to insist. This was diplomatic ground and diplomacy was hers. I walked second. Owen Hart, Seth Price, Leo Webb, and 4 other officers followed. Behind us, 2 representatives from the allied species who had agreed to serve as formal observers. I watched the Varek aides watch us walk in. I watched them count. Not the number of people. They were counting something else. The way we walked. The fact that we had slept and were therefore upright and steady. The way none of us looked like people who had been grinding themselves to nothing for 2 months, though we had been, absolutely. The particular skill of not showing it is one learned across centuries of facing species that read visible weakness the way others read text. We sat down. Vel Sora opened the session with the formal Concord greeting in all 5 recognized languages, which took approximately 4 minutes and was entirely ceremonial, and I used those 4 minutes to look at the treaty text on the wall and breathe in the slow and deliberate way Nina had taught me during the preliminary weeks, the technique that keeps a heart rate level when everything in you wants the opposite. Nina spoke first for our side. She laid out the human position in clear and sequential terms. Not aggressive. Not conciliatory. Precise, the way surgery is precise, each word where it needed to be and nowhere else. She said that humanity came to these talks in the interest of a lasting resolution. She said that any resolution would need to account for the actions taken against General Daniil Okafor and for the consequences of those actions. She said that humanity was not seeking punishment. It was seeking acknowledgement and terms. Vel Sora listened. When she finished he was quiet in the Varek way, a subtle shifting of harmonic frequency that looks to human observers like a pause but is actually a form of internal consultation. Then he spoke. He said that the choir recognized the weight of the present moment. He said that the action taken against General Okafor had been, and here he used a Varek word that translates roughly as a measure whose consequences exceeded its calculation. He did not say mistake. He did not say error. He said the thing that 900-year-old beings say when they are not capable of using the simpler word but need to indicate its direction. Nina looked at me. I gave her nothing. She turned back to Vel Sora and said, "We would ask the choir to use a word that can be entered into the treaty record with a clear meaning in all 5 languages." The room was very quiet. Vel Sora's harmonics shifted again. Then he said, in Concord Common, which is the standard language for formal agreements, and in a tone that had no color in it at all, the way things said at great cost have no color, the action was an error. Nina wrote it into the record. 3 words. They will be in that treaty for as long as the treaty holds. Every species that reads the document will read them. Every student of Concord history, for however long Concord history runs, will read that the Varek choir, in the formal record of the Solon Station talks, declared their action against General Okafor an error. I thought about the 14-year-old girl's poem. I thought about 60 people at a relay station taking a vote. I thought, he would have had a word for this moment. A quiet and dry word that would have made it slightly smaller and therefore easier to hold without spilling. I did not have his gift for that. So I just held it. The talks lasted 11 days. I want to give you the shape of those 11 days without getting lost in every corner of them, because the corners were sometimes narrow and not all of them are mine to describe. Day 1 established the foundational acknowledgement. The error on the record. Days 2 through 4 addressed the question of the revised Solon Accords. The Varek choir had invoked them unilaterally. The 3 observer species had declined to recognize the invocation. Nina argued, with a precision that made Seth Price quietly exhale once through his nose in something approaching admiration, that the invocation was procedurally invalid under the original treaty framework and therefore constituted a second action requiring acknowledgement. Vel Sora's delegation argued for 3 days. Nina did not move. On day 4, the secondary acknowledgement went into the record. Day 5 was the hardest day. This was the day we addressed the 2 things that actually mattered for the future: human military autonomy and the question of territory. I am going to tell you something about the territory question that I have not said publicly before. The original human proposal, the one Nina and I drafted in the preliminary weeks, asked for 3 systems. 2 were chosen for strategic value. 1 was chosen because General Okafor had flagged it in a private note inside the standing orders files, years ago, as a system that would matter someday and should not be ceded. He had written that note 6 years before his death. He had been right. The Varek choir agreed to 2 systems. They would not move on the 3rd. 4 days of argument and they would not move. On the night of day 8, Owen sat with me again in the communications bay. He looked at the map display showing the 3 systems. He said, "Is the 3rd system worth extending this?" I thought about it for a long time. Then I said, "No." We took 2 systems. The agreement on human military autonomy was, in the end, simpler than I had expected. The Varek choir had run their models. Their models now included the correct variable. They did not want to run the model again with a restricted answer. They agreed to full human military autonomy with no Concord oversight. Unconditional. The clause went into the treaty in language that Nina Cole will tell you is among the cleanest she has ever read in a formal document, and she spent 15 years reading formal documents before any of this started. Day 9 was the ceremonial language. The preamble, the signatories, the provisions for renewal. Here I asked for the one thing I had held back for the entire 11 days. The one thing I had not raised in any preliminary session. The one thing that was mine specifically and that I had decided, somewhere around day 3 of the preliminary weeks, I would ask for at the end when the rest was settled. I asked that the renewal address at each future Concord Summit be delivered by the senior human military officer, as the first address of each session, in perpetuity. Vel Sora's delegation reviewed this request for a full day. They came back and said they found it acceptable, categorizing it as a ceremonial provision. Nina wrote it into the treaty. She looked at me across the table and I could see that she understood exactly what it was and was choosing not to say so, which was the correct diplomatic instinct and also the correct human instinct, because some things do not need to be named out loud to work. Day 10, Final Review. Day 11, Signing. The signing happened at the central podium. The same podium. I had been thinking about this moment for weeks, trying to decide how I would feel about standing in that spot. Whether it would be difficult. Whether I needed to prepare for it in some specific way. It was not difficult. It was the opposite of difficult. It was the most certain I had felt in 2 months, the most settled, the most right. Not in a triumphant way. In the way that completing an obligation feels right. In the way that honoring a debt feels right. I signed for humanity. My name went below 500 years of names, below the original signatories of the Solon Treaty, below the names of every human who had stood in this hall and extended the peace for another generation. My name, followed by my rank and station and the date. Marin Voss. Sergeant Adjutant. Senior Human Military Officer. Solon Station. I put the pen down. Nina signed after me. Then Owen. Then the observers from the allied species. Vel Sora signed for the Varek choir. The Concord Arbiter read the closing provision, the same words that close every treaty session, a formal declaration that the agreement was entered into freely and would be honored by all signatories. It was done. After the session formally closed, the hall began to empty in the slow and complicated way diplomatic gatherings empty, Small conversations, careful exchanges, the particular dance of people being civil after weeks of being adversarial. I stayed near the podium. I was looking at the treaty text on the eastern wall. Not the old text, the original Solin language. The new edition. Someone from the station's maintenance division had, without being asked, updated the wall display to include the opening line of the new agreement. They had added it overnight, between day 10 and day 11, so it was there when the signing session began. I had not ordered this. I had not expected it. The new line read, "In acknowledgement of the past and in service of what is to come, the signatories reaffirm the foundational principle, what is built in good faith shall be defended in kind." I do not know who wrote that line. Nina tells me it was a composite, that it evolved across 3 drafts from 4 different contributors and that by the end nobody was sure who had originated which part. She says that is how the best treaty language usually gets made. Vel Sora appeared at my left. He did not announce himself. He simply was there, the way old beings are sometimes simply there, as if they have been present in the general vicinity of any given moment long enough that their presence has become ambient. He looked at the wall. He said, "Your general was a remarkable person." I said, "Yes." He said, "In 9 centuries I have observed many species. Many individuals. I have observed that the species which endure are not always the oldest or the largest or the most sophisticated. They are the species which produce, at intervals, people who understand what they are building and are willing to pay for it." I did not respond to that. He continued. He said, "We calculated the removal of an obstacle. We did not calculate for what the obstacle was protecting." He was quiet for a moment. His harmonics held the low frequency of something very old considering something it had not previously understood. Then he said, "We did not calculate for what an obstacle, removed, reveals." I turned and looked at him directly. He was 900 years old. He had participated in the formal end of 2 civilizations. He had read humanity the way you read a brief summary and assumed you had understood the subject completely. He was looking at me with the specific expression of a being who has updated its understanding and is still processing the cost of having needed to. I said, "No. You did not." I walked away. I walked past Owen, who was talking to Seth near the gallery exit. I walked past Nina, who was already organizing the treaty documentation with the focused energy of someone who would be working on it for the next 3 months. I walked past Leo Webb, who raised one hand as I passed. Not a salute. Just a gesture, the kind that passes between people who have been through something together. I went to the viewport at the end of the gallery. The 14 systems were out there. I could not see them from here, the viewport showed only the station's immediate sector, a small piece of a very large thing. But I knew what was out there. Shipyards running. Research posts publishing. Engineers solving problems that had waited 11 years. A girl who had written a poem. 60 people at a relay station who had taken a vote. I took the badge out of my pocket. It was a small thing. A rectangle of composite material with his name on it and his rank and his authorization level. The kind of item produced by the hundreds for every summit. The kind of thing that gets discarded when the summit is over. A piece of ordinary administrative material. I turned it over in my hands. I thought about toast and tea and a seating chart and a man who had walked to a podium knowing what was waiting there. I thought about the West Gallery. About being moved to the West Gallery. About the question I had carried without an answer for 2 months. I looked at the badge one last time. Then I placed it back in my breast pocket. Over the left side. Where it had been since the first day. Not as a memorial. Not as a reminder. As something I was carrying forward. The treaty was signed. The 14 systems were out there. There was work to do. Right, then.